think it's a really good question. Looking at insomnia through the lens of the 5 koshas adapted came really naturally, because we as yogis will look at people and sort of say, okay, well, we all have a physical, an energetic, a mental, emotional, and a kind of a spiritual or soulful component to how we understand ourselves and each other. And I'm borrowing very loosely from the 5 koshas so that we have 5 sort of reasonably distinct aspects of ourselves to look at. So the first bit of tackling insomnia from a yoga perspective is that the physical stuff, the tension that we carry in our bodies and the pain that we have in our bodies really does affect all of the other layers. It affects the way we think, it affects the way we feel, it affects our basic levels of energy, whether we feel lethargic or whether we feel really energetic. And you know, we're souls in these bodies for however long we've got. And a lot of the approaches to insomnia, pretty much all of the approaches that I'd seen, I'd read books about insomnia and sleep, and there would be maybe like a couple of pages, 2-3 pages out of a few hundred that said progressive muscle relaxation is good for you. So they'd say, okay, progressive muscle relaxation is good for you, and you should try tensing and relaxing muscles in your body. And that's great. It would be fantastic if that did it for everybody. But it doesn't really seem to. And it certainly didn't do it for me as an insomniac when I was reading all those books and trying to recover from my own insomnia. And you know, simply stretching maybe isn't quite as targeted. And we know that when we add the breath work and the intentionality of a yoga practice, it has a much more transformative effect than just stretching your muscles prior to doing sport. And we also know that when you have a physical posture that's tight or tense, then it actually has an effect on your mood. It has an effect on your thought patterns. It has an effect on your neurochemistry and your neurophysiology ultimately. So we have to kind of work through that stuff. And although the majority of this discussion is about the emotional effect of, or the emotional effects that insomnia has and how we sort of heal from that, it's impossible to delink that from the physical stuff. You know, one of the most important things is that we're not separate. We know this as yogis, and that's not new to any yoga teachers and practitioners. But in the outside world, I think as yogis, we completely take for granted. People do not have this depth of relationship among all of the layers of themselves. I was actually really pleased. I got one review out of all the 10 or 11 reviews on Amazon that I got. There was one that said, well, there's nothing new in here. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting, because so many people that I encounter in courses and workshops and classes, they're just not doing all of the stuff that links the physical, the energetic, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. So if there are people that think that this isn't new, that's actually a win. I'd rather that there be no need for this book. But what I'm seeing is that people are looking at it and sort of saying, oh, well, the sleep hygiene stuff, that's not new. But the sequences and how they're used and how they affect you very deeply, if you use them with your clients, you will see that they have a tremendous effect. And when people do the physical practices and the breath practices, they change emotionally and psychologically. And what's really interesting is how that affects people who have had emotional upheavals, because we know that our sleep goes out of balance when we go through a house move, a divorce, a job change, a bereavement, any number of things. That's going to affect our sleep, and it can lead to ongoing insomnia if we don't have ways of coming back from those emotional upheavals. And similarly, my own insomnia many years ago was really intractable because of a post-traumatic stress disorder type presentation, and I had no idea that was going on. We have much greater understanding of that stuff nowadays, but most of the approaches to insomnia kind of sidestep that. So I thought it was really important to include some stuff on trauma sensitivity in our approach as yogis and therapists and practitioners in dealing with insomnia. So the question about Ayurveda and Ayurvedic doshic types and how that relates to the way we respond emotionally, and then how that affects our sleep. This is not hard and fast. sets of rules. But I think it's really interesting when I work with people, especially one-to-one, to have an understanding of the basic ways in which they tend to respond to things, because that makes it a lot easier to figure out which practices are going to be most valuable for them, and where we can have, what I think of as the quickest wins, the ways of people seeing results and seeing impacts on their lives as immediately as possible, knowing of course that dealing with a long-term and very intractable insomnia can take more time. But if we look at someone who has a more kapha, if you know anything about Ayurveda, the kapha elements are water and earth, and if you think about somebody who is more watery and earthy, those elements they're more dense, right? So someone who's a little bit more tending towards depression or inertia or stubbornness, that kind of person could be really patient and really loving and really steadfast in lots of good ways. But when they go out of balance, their tendency might be towards a more depressive presentation. So dealing with their insomnia as opposed to dealing with a more pitta type or more Ayurvedically vata type is going to be completely different. So it tends to be that people who have more of a kapha physicality as well as kind of emotional presentation, what we need to do is help them mobilize and improve their circulation, get their mood elevated. So things like breath of joy, the arms moving up, out, up, and then down, getting more cardiovascular activity, especially not so much at night, but certainly in the morning and throughout the day. Someone who has a more vata Ayurvedic type is really airy and really up and really anxious, when they go out of balance. Really creative and really, tending towards movement. It's so different for somebody who's more kapha. That person who's anxious and almost seems to hover above their sheets and is really reactive, sparky, which might be more of a fire type. We'll talk about that in a moment. When you have an Ayurvedically vata person, what they really need in order to be able to sleep is grounding. They need to spend their energy and their movement, but they also need to really be grounded before bed, whereas somebody who's kapha, they'll be much more grounded to start with, and they need to get mobilized. And emotionally speaking, the Ayurvedic kapha type will be moving more towards depression. And of course, these are not... they're not definite, but they're just general tendencies that I've observed. And the vata type will be more towards anxiety, and the pitta type will be more towards maybe anger or impatience or constant activity, right? And it's not to say that somebody who's a pitta type and very fiery never feels depressed, but often it's a result of burnout, right? As opposed to being stuck, and they'd be more impatient and more prone towards almost like an adrenal fatigue. Whereas the vata type, the anxiety has this kind of, this kind of movement here. The pitta type is very, always moving forward, and the kapha type tends to be more stuck. So emotionally speaking, people will get stuck in their repetitive thoughts and their repetitive ways of dealing with things. So creating practices that help people to either energize if they're more kapha, to de-adrenalize if they're more pitta, and to ground if they're more vata. Generally speaking, they really help. And you start to see that when somebody's more comfortable and balanced in their body, their emotions and their thought patterns tend to follow suit in that really important feedback loop. This next question about how you adapt sequences and practices to be trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive. When I started out teaching yoga, more than 15 years ago, these types of words were not on the tips of our tongue. And, anything that was yoga therapeutic, there was the kind of one-to-one element of things where you're always responsive to the client. But I learned yoga in a way that was this is the effect of this practice. And if you want this, then you should do that. And any one-to-one teaching, any yoga therapy approach would say we always have to look and see what the impact is on the student, on the client, on the class, when we're giving any sort of practice. And I don't claim to be an expert in trauma-sensitive yoga. There are people who've really got that covered. There's a great book by Dagmar Harl, and there are great books by David Emerson, and I did some training here in London with Alex Catt and the Yoga Clinic. And there are tons of people who really cover this in great depth, but in terms of insomnia, we need to understand that when people have had a post-traumatic stress response, one of the primary things that happens is that their sleep will go. That was certainly the case for me. When I first started doing yoga, there was a huge benefit to doing it, but I was really, really limited. I had asthma. I was quite frightened. Like, my whole system was very frightened, and it was very hard to just calm down. So a lot of the yoga practices, even doing shavasana or some of the, for example, lengthened exhale breathing, I found it really difficult. So I needed to really approach those practices very slowly. And so when I see students or yoga therapy clients that have trouble with things, it's really clear that you don't just push through those things. And one of the hallmarks of certain types of post-traumatic responses is that there will be what you could call a paradoxical effect, right? So something that's supposed to be relaxing is incredibly stressful, right, for that certain percentage of people. And it depends on where you're teaching. If you're teaching a group class, what percentage of people will have these kinds of paradoxical effects. So my colleagues in London teach refugee women yoga classes. I would expect that if you've been through something as difficult as a refugee situation, the likelihood's pretty high that a number of people are going to find it really difficult at the end of a yoga class to lie down on their back in a room full of strangers and close their eyes and feel safe just completely open like that. That might happen after many, many years of finding comfort, but I wouldn't expect that to be the first port of call. And similarly, when I've worked with people who've had problems with childhood sexual abuse in the past, like, there are some movements that they're just not, they don't feel good. Whether it's lying down on the back or bringing the legs open or even child's pose. So what I often do with people who have a really difficult insomnia is, when we talk about the simple sleep sequence, I sort of show a picture of it, and I say, these are some movements that I suggest. And I really learned a lot about invitational language as opposed to directional language when I did this training with the yoga clinic. It was just like a little introductory training, but it really fundamentally affected the way I spoke about yoga practices. And using invitational language and saying, what do you think of these shapes? Do you think your body would be comfortable in the shape? Would you like me to demonstrate it? Would you like to try it? And it's useful to be aware that some people, depending on what their past history has been, will be really wanting to comply and will really want to do the shapes, will want to do the movements because they'll want to kind of be good at it, or genuinely get the benefits from it that are being hinted at or being promised. And it's easy to see sometimes, if you're really looking, that people will go into a pose and they'll kind of freeze, they'll kind of either shake, their eyes will go somewhere else and they'll kind of check out, or just even a little flicker of fear across a person's face, or a little bit of a distaste in doing a certain movement. And that just requires a little or a lot of sensitivity and good communication between you and the student or client, especially when you're working one-to-one. It's a lot. It can be a lot easier when you're working in classes. There's certain things, as I said, like child's pose, lying down on the back with the eyes closed, closing the eyes at all in a room full of people. Any number of things. I'll always say, if you feel at all uncomfortable with this, you don't have to do it. Right? You're a grown-up. You're here by choice. Everything that we're doing is intended to provide you with a benefit, and if you don't have to give any reason why. And if someone is avoiding certain things, I might sensitively go over and say, is there something else that we can give you to do? Is there something that would help you to feel more comfortable? And that just requires a bit of practice. So generally speaking, the key points are, if you're working with somebody who's had a history of sexual abuse, child abuse. They've had some other kind of trauma that causes them to startle or shock in certain positions. It's just useful to say, note what your response is, and that's actually okay. So the practices don't get kind of layered upon the person. The practices always have to be the things that the person responds well to generally. So another piece of yoga, looking at yoga practices that help with recovering from insomnia that is related to trauma. Meditation and breath work. Sometimes people will find it really easy to do lengthened inhale, lengthened exhale, counting the breath. Some people will gravitate towards that. Some people will find it really easy to close their eyes and meditate, or average degree of easy. But if there's been any situation in which somebody's been under duress, if they've been coerced or forced to do anything, if they're worried about closing their eyes, if they don't feel safe in their bodies, if they've I worked at one point with a journalist who was in a war area and was in a building that had been bombed. It can feel very unsafe to do things like just simply close your eyes and follow your breath. So a lot of the practices in the book are suggestions, and it can be easier for some people to just start breathing in a natural breath and notice their breath with the eyes open. And then even something like lengthening the exhale to approach that slowly. Retaining the breath, holding the breath. This won't be new to a lot of you guys who are yoga therapists and yoga teachers with a long history of experience, but it's just to raise it for those that are a little bit newer, who maybe just haven't considered it. I'll give you an example. At this point, after doing yoga for something like probably 25 years now, if I wake up in the middle of the night, I'll often do a 4-7-8 breath. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. I never could have done that when I first started doing yoga. Again, not just for the reason of having had asthma, but I was breathing so slowly and so tightly that counting my breath at any point would make me panicked. And I have students and clients who are like this all the time, regardless of what their history might be, from all different parts of the spectrum of things that have happened to people. Some people just don't like it. So if I had read one of those articles that we often find on the internet that say, okay, well, in order to get back to sleep, inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8, I would have been like, no, yoga doesn't work for me and breathing practices don't work for me, because it would have been a bridge too far for my nervous system, and it would have been too stress producing for me. So it's just being aware that we want to keep things as simple as possible. And I think as yoga teachers, certainly I've fallen prey to this idea that I need to give something really interesting or really good or really different. And I've learned in terms of insomnia stuff, helping people to get back to sleep, it's got to be as simple as possible. And we want it to be simple, and we want it to be holistic, and we want it to be something that people will very easily remember. Because if those simple practices work, it's much better that they take those into their lives rather than trying to make it more complex. So it may be fun to do long chains of dynamic vinyasa, or do much more elevating breath practices, or more complex counts and holds with the breath to achieve certain psycho-spiritual states. But really for sleep, the simpler the better. And the more complex a person's startle response is, and the more panic in the system, the more we just need to pare it back. So that's just a hint around things like breath practices. Now with meditation, slowly building the capacity to sit with the eyes soft or closed is actually really, really helpful. But it's something that for some people needs to come in after they feel a sense of bodily safety. That's why I put the physical aspects of sleep recovery first. This business of using your mind over matter, it's fine, but if the body is really tight and tense, we now have tons of books that say the body keeps the score, the body remembers, when the body says no, and these are all books that talk about trauma. And you've got Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Judith Herman, great authors to talk about trauma. And we now know that like you just can't boss yourself around with your mind. It's great to have like cognitive behavioral therapy and a number of other types of approaches. They do work wonders for a lot of people, but if it doesn't work, we don't want to keep pushing it on that command and control approach to the body. So using physical sleep recovery methods really helps us to do things like meditate, and then we become more able to go into deeper sleep states, and then the whole system begins to repair over time. Okay, so I'm sitting here with the book, Yoga Therapy for Insomnia and Sleep Recovery. And one of the things that I thought was really potentially, and you can tell me what you think, potentially useful is to include some guidelines for teaching public classes in a way that promotes good sleep and helps people to recover from insomnia. Because what I've tried to do in the book is to help you to teach privately in a more sensitive way, and especially for the people who've taken the training that I do, to create multi-week courses that progressively take people through the different layers of sleep recovery, from the physical to the energetic, mental, emotional, and soulful or spiritual. And we're also seeing this epidemic in sleep problems for lots of reasons. It's not just that we're on our phones, it's that we're like disconnected, and the nervous system is really heightened because I've taken to reading books before bed, because there's like no incoming, and you can't link to lots of other things, and there's no light source shining into your eyes. It's not just the light that's the reason that our phones are so kind of insidious when it comes to going to bed, but that thing of constant connection and stimulation is one of the things that we're really combating as yoga teachers. So I think it's really important to incorporate sensitivity to sleep issues into classes, and not to do really powerful heating practices really late in the evening, and to be aware of the way in which your sequencing affects people's sleep. And along those lines, I included some trauma sensitivity considerations in the book. And so the first part, and just to show you the fourth chapter, so we've got these 5 layers. The fourth chapter is called Emotional Recovery for Sleep. I don't know if you can see that. It's all about the emotional aspects of sleepless nights, like life transitions and the Ayurvedic stuff that we talked about in terms of the different reactions that we have to what goes on in our lives. But then the second part is around different types of PTSD and their impact, whether it's relational or situational. And then there's a bit about working with people one-to-one, identifying the effects of trauma, things like hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, denial, considerations for asana, considerations for pranayama, considerations for meditation and mantra, things you want to be aware of, and then becoming more trauma-informed in group classes. Looking at the environment, the language, how you assist and touch people. A lot of these things are not considerations that were part of my initial training many years ago, that I think and should hope that trainings are now taking into account a good deal more after the whole, not only the Me Too movement in the broader social context, but a lot of the things that we've seen in the context of yoga teaching and yoga lineages. So you will be, hopefully, and I imagine, sensitive to these things, but in terms of insomnia and trauma sensitivity, just guidelines for physical adjustments and how you choose practices and how you might consider managing unexpected reactions in a group class. It's very, for new teachers, at least years ago when I was starting, there was a sense that if the student wasn't doing what you were asking them to do, they were being like insubordinate, or they weren't a good student, or they weren't listening or something. But there are a lot of reasons why people will hesitate or check out or tune out or not do what you're telling them to do. And it doesn't mean you're a bad teacher, and it doesn't mean that they're not listening. So there are some considerations there. And and just simply the I was at the International Association of Yoga Therapists conference in California in June, and it was fascinating to have conversations about scope of practice, and to really, I'm probably telling you things you already know, but just to reiterate, you don't need to know everything. And as a yoga teacher and as a yoga therapist, there will be lots of things that are outside of your scope of practice. And when you encounter those things, to have a really good set of referrals onward to qualified psychotherapists, qualified, particularly trauma sensitive therapists, and somatic psychotherapists, and somatic experiencing practitioners, and people who will work with others in a somatically body-related, savvy way. Because a lot of the stuff of, certainly my experience in looking at how psychotherapy works, a lot of the talking stuff, if there's a trauma response, there needs to be some movement through the body as well, and that needs to be really well educated and informed on the part of the therapist. They need to know what they're looking at when they're seeing that certain physical response in their client, and not just hearing the words and not just processing the situations. So hopefully that empowers you to know that you can offer practices and you can adapt practices. And the intention of this was to have a program and a container that holds that process and gives alternatives for each of those different layers. And when I work with people, I'll often do an initial intake to see where we might focus, and then we'll work together for 6 weeks, and we'll see where the major impacts are happening. That the insomnia is improving, and if it's not improving, there are certain things that you can't yoga away. And I recently had a young man come to a yoga for insomnia course. It was a 4-week course, and what he was describing with his insomnia, and he had a history of certain medications. I just said, it sounds like you really need to go to a sleep clinic, because if you're doing everything and it's not working, then there's probably something else that's going on that we can't necessarily deal with through yoga. So there's probably something neurochemical or something that isn't being disclosed to me in that context. So generally speaking, if people have some range of symptoms and some range of difficulties with sleep, this approach will work if they actually do it. Doesn't work if you don't do it. It has no chance of working if you don't do it. But if you do it, it will definitely have effects. That same person that said that his sleep was still a problem for him, he looks dramatically different. Like, he's not remotely as keyed up as he once was. He's better rested than he once was, but he doesn't still have a typical sleep pattern of a big chunk of sleep at night and wakefulness all day. He's got a problem with having trouble with feeling really tired throughout the day and not getting that chunk of sleep. But the symptoms have actually improved, even though it's not brought him back to what you would consider a normal presentation. So the stuff works if you do it, because yoga does good stuff for all of us, generally, if we find the right practices for us. But we also want to stay within our scope of practice and learn how to refer onward, to medical practitioners and psychological experts as well. So in signing off, it's been a pleasure to be able to talk about the book and to share it. And what I'd really love to invite you to do as a yoga therapist, as a yoga teacher, as a practitioner, someone who helps people with their own well-being, is to be part of the conversation about how we approach insomnia and how we approach sleep recovery. Because the problems seem to be getting worse, and to be able to offer more and more refined solutions is tremendously helpful. So if you've been watching this video and you have questions, thoughts, concerns, feedback, suggestions, if you have some experience in working with insomnia and you wanted to feedback, well, this is what I do and it's been really useful, do feed that back. If it's something that I haven't considered, I'd love to hear about it. If it's something where there are reasons why I haven't adopted it, but others find it tremendously helpful. I'll give an example in that, like Yoga Nidra. It's a phenomenal practice and one that I don't have any problem with and absolutely adore, but it's something that for the most part is administered by someone else to the person receiving it. So everything in this book is stuff that a person can administer to herself. It's endogenous. It comes from within, goes to within. But so there are a lot of things that haven't been included for very specific reasons, and not because they're bad or wrong. And there are things that have been included for specific reasons. But one of the things that I think is going to be really phenomenally interesting is to develop an evidence base about what works and under what circumstances and how. And I'm really, really keen to get people together who are working in the UK, in the NHS, and in medical contexts anywhere in the world, in schools, in corporations and offices, any sort of work setting, to see if we can offer a yoga therapy approach to insomnia and sleep recovery as a cadre of people who have a certain degree of information and are providing this kind of service. So I'm working with Yoga Campus to offer training in the UK, and we're interested in bringing it to really any other part of the world where there are people that want to anchor it.